Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. It's been a tough year for educators, parents, and students, with remote learning just not taking the place of in-person classes. But there is some positive news: more money for education in New Mexico and hope for progress in building an equitable education system. But what challenges remain? I am pleased to have with us the president of the National Education Association New Mexico, Las Cruces educator, Mary Parr-Sanchez. Mary, it is good to have you here today. I want to start with news that has come out. It is, very disturbing to people in terms of the pandemic. After just 1 week in school, some 300 Las Cruces students, as you know, had to isolate after 8 COVID-19 cases spread across 2 high schools and a number of elementary schools were discovered. Tell me what situations like that have been like for teachers in New Mexico, and then of course the adjustment to remote learning, because a lot of students are still doing remote learning.
Yes, so that very condition that happened in Las Cruces is happening statewide, where we are starting to test students. If we haven't done it yet, we will very soon. And to help keep the spread and so we can detect cases in schools with students, we can detect them more quickly and perhaps not have to quarantine so many people. But I know now in Las Cruces, it said 300 student and staff were in quarantine, and it really taxes an already overburdened system where there are not substitutes that can step in. So when an educator has to quarantine, they can go into the virtual setting, but the workload is really becoming quite difficult, and to be in person, one day and then virtual the next, and then in person at the same time that you're doing virtual instruction. So it's very worrisome. Also, just for the health of and safety of the students and educators in our schools.
Absolutely. Schools, even though they're welcoming students back into the classroom, as I mentioned, many parents have opted to keep their kids home. What would you say are the biggest challenges that remain in schools? Because you've dealt with this drumbeat of people wanting to reopen the schools, but very quickly we've seen that there are real risks involved in doing that.
Yes, so the biggest challenges have been, the theory is that schools are controlled environments, and they are to a certain extent. But if you try to think of a room full of kindergarten students, or more, at my level, I'm a middle school teacher, a room full of middle school students or high school students, it's very difficult to keep them socially distanced. It's been very difficult in society to keep people socially distanced, and so those same challenges present in schools, and the whole sanitation and washing your hands and all the protocols that schools have worked so hard to do. We have so many staff, from administrators on down, that have just put hours and hours into developing these procedures and processes for students to be able to return safely. But the fact of the matter is, we're still in a pandemic, that many of our adults have been vaccinated, and many of our educators, but there are still a majority of parents that students return home to that have not been vaccinated. And so we remain very concerned about safety for students, for parents, and for staff members.
And Mary, as you know, this is not hypothetical. As you know, there's a concern about variants that are more likely to infect children who then might take the virus home to their parents. They might be affected too. Dr. Michael Osterholm, the director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, warned that a fourth surge is just now beginning in America. This is his view. He noted on NBC that more than 700 schools in Minnesota reported COVID-19 cases. What are you hearing from teachers about their concerns, knowing about Minnesota and perhaps other states where we may begin to see variants like this become widespread?
So being the president of the National Education Association in New Mexico, I'm very lucky because I can network with teachers from other states, and we frequently do network. And you're right, in Michigan, in Minnesota, there have been variants that are being driven into the population of students, because again, many adults or educators have been vaccinated, but the concern is really our students, and especially students of color. And New Mexico is a majority state, and we live in a culture that values families living in multi-generational settings. We also have many people in New Mexico. 40% of our students live in poverty. And what that really means in terms of their health is that they live close together and they live with many other people also. And those are, situations that place them at more risk of becoming infected with the virus. So we worry, and we are seeing it happen across the nation. And, I think we open schools now at the end of the year. My position and our position as an organization is that we should have stayed remote through the rest of the school year. But, we will defer to the wisdom of others in that there's been a lot of work to prepare and ready schools, but for these reasons that you bring up, I don't think waiting through the summer to keep things virtual, learning was occurring, it just wasn't in person. And there were certain there's students that were having trouble accessing.
Okay, well, certainly this is a situation we'll talk about likely again. It's something that will continue to develop, and hopefully during the summer things will get better. But it's so important to talk about this because I think sometimes this dialogue is more controlled about what people want rather than what's happening on the ground. And so it's very important to get the facts out there, and the fact that this is not easy. This is extremely difficult to start this up again, in-person learning during a pandemic. I want to move to some positive news, and it's related to something you just talked about in relation to poverty in our state, the New Mexico legislative session. The governor signed legislation establishing the Family Income Index, which will direct additional funding, as you know, to schools with concentrated poverty, which is known to contribute to low academic performance. Your thoughts on this decision?
So I think this is a super innovative and creative decision, and I don't know where this idea originated, if it was in the New Mexico PED or with the governor, but I do think it is very creative in nature and innovative and super exciting. And I do think that this is the state trying something new that could have a super positive impact on students and families. As a supporter of community schools, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about that, this family income index could certainly provide services that a community school would, or even to hire an on-site coordinator to try to bring in other resources into the school. I'm very excited about the family income index, and I think it's a really good idea.
Yeah, something I hadn't heard about either until it was passed in New Mexico. We'll be watching it. As you mentioned, I know the NEA, your organization, not just here, but around the country, has been a big advocate for something else called community schools. We have them in Las Cruces, where support services and referrals are provided at school. Tell me how this is going and how it's helping.
It's going really well. And so community schools are important. They do provide support services, but the most critical piece of a community school is they really elevate communication with families and parents and communities. And so there is a shared leadership model in a community school and an additional staff person called an on-site coordinator that can really work with parents in the community to see what the school is doing well and where the school may need help. So, and then to bring in resources in the areas where the school may need additional resources. So in Las Cruces, we've tripled the number of community schools. There is a grant for new schools that are interested in becoming community schools. That new grants are being offered, and we continue to work to spread this model across the state, and it is spreading. So
that's great to hear, and good to have some good news amid all of the difficulties of the last year. Of course, while there was a lot of progress in the legislative session, there's also concern as well, some areas where progress hasn't been as quick. In recent years, the state has increased teacher salaries, but this year investments were not made in that area. Only a small cost of living adjustment, likely to be lower than the actual cost of living increases facing families. It varies by district, but starting teachers are paid about 20% less in New Mexico as compared to El Paso. What can be done to make changing this a priority, Mary?
So I think there is some really good news on the horizon, and it's going to be left in the hands of the voters. And so this legislative session, it was determined by both houses, the House and the Senate, that a constitutional question would go to the voters, and that is to fully fund early childhood education and additionally an additional funding for K-12 education by a slightly larger percentage of the land grant permanent fund money that funds public schools in New Mexico and has since the late 1800s when the land grant permanent fund was enacted. It's going to go to the voters in November of 2022, and the following year there could be a substantial more money flowing into schools for the next years. And I think we have a substantial teacher shortage in New Mexico and across the nation that I think higher salaries will attract more people into the profession. And having more teachers go to school to become educators is really important for families, because the quality of that educator in their to their child is there's nothing more important than that, than a well-trained, highly qualified person to be in every New Mexico classroom. And we know that it does sometimes come down to the starting salary.
And Mary, we should emphasize this is not hypothetical, right? I mean, I have personally known teachers in Las Cruces who have gone to an El Paso district because of the higher pay there, and I'm sure you have as well.
Yes, I have, and it just feeds on a problem that continues to weaken the foundation of education. And I think, to the credit of everybody up north in the legislature, they understand that, and I don't think there's huge political divide on that issue. I think it is well known that we need to increase the salaries of educators, and I believe that once we can get past the pandemic, and if we can, if that constitutional amendment passes, that there's good news on that horizon.
Okay, we'll have to wait for the voters, and of course then the process, if it passes, to decide how that money is directed. Well, as you know, speaking of money, there are also concerns about stabilizing the pension system. And full disclosure, this also affects some KRWG employees who are part of that system, as university employees are in New Mexico. Some, including the Albuquerque Journal, have said that employees need to pay more, but the Journal editorial on this recently did not mention that employees already put in about 11% of their pay into the system. That's about double the national average for these types of plans. So of course some say that is simply not an answer, particularly when pay is already low.
So yes, our pension fund, and for educators it's called the Educational Retirement Fund, is we can kind of compare it to the PARA, which is the pension fund of police officers and firefighters and state employees. It has been considerably underfunded in comparison to that other state pension fund. And what I think people don't realize in New Mexico is that educators pay into their fund, like you said, more, double what educators in other states are paying. So, and educators have had their pension percentage that they pay raised over the last 4 or 5 years. So the ERB executive director and the board, they knew that they couldn't continue to raise rates on the employees. So they did, the bill did pass. Now it was modified in the 11th hour from 4 years to only be in effect for 2 years, but the employer will pay a 1% increase over the next 2 years. And I think another thing that has to happen, and President Biden was very clear about this in the American Recovery Plan Act, and people call it ARPA. He specifically called out, helping pension funds, because nationally, workers' pension funds, and like me, I've taught for 30 years. My husband taught the same amount of time. We don't want to end up on a park bench when we're in our twilight years. And we have put in funding and, for this since the late 1980s. And I think that some folks believe that, this is a benefit, and it is a benefit of a large group, and the employer and employee pay a percentage, but we pay a much higher percentage than in many other states.
And so, not only that, Mary, I mean, you didn't mention this, but of course the other pension system you mentioned for state employees, not educators, PERA, PARA, that is much more comparable to the national average, half or less than half of what educators pay, which is close to, again, 11%. I don't think there's much, there's a lot of folks who know that unless they know an educator.
Right. And the thing that's interesting also, it's interesting, and it may also be, well, I don't know what it would be, but incidentally, in ERB, which is the Educator Fund, educators are predominantly still women. A majority of educators, even though there are many men, a majority is still women. Whereas in PERA, a majority of law enforcement, they still continue to be men, even though we know women are in law enforcement. So there is also just the equity issue in how the state has more readily funded the former rather than the latter. So we believe that there's a lot of work that needs to be done for ERB, and that is the Education Retirement Fund. And that's one of the roles that public employees in unions, workers that come together, that's one of the things we do is oversight. And I can't emphasize to our newer educators how important the role of oversight is, both in our medical benefits and in our retirement benefits. Because when you're a brand new educator coming in, you're just busy doing the work of schools and carry, you're concerned on your lessons and your instruction. As you become, more proficient at that, though, we all need to give oversight, because we know that what we don't hold to account, sometimes, funny business happens. I don't know how else to say it, in that we have a role as we move through our careers to provide oversight to those very important issues that workers face.
And some people would say, remember, this doesn't just affect the workers, but it affects everyone, because this is one of the powerful ways that educators stay in their positions. They want to stay in that pension fund if it's sustainable for them. And then you have teachers who have much more experience in the classroom, and that benefits students, having experienced teachers. Well, we're quickly running out of time, and I want to talk big picture now. What a change in Washington, D.C. President Joe Biden, a very big supporter of labor and union rights. Tell me about the impact there.
So he's also a big supporter of educators, and his wife, as you may or may not know, is a member of the National Education Association. And so it's good because we don't have to explain things to him, because his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, has been she's been woman-splaining things to him for many years about educators and about their needs, and so that they can be fully present for the little people that we educate and, help guide through life. So it's just been a game changer having a labor-friendly, education-friendly president. It's night and day.
Yeah, and this isn't just talk either, or his wife. As you know, the former Boston mayor, Marty Walsh, is Labor's secretary. Walsh is a former union leader. He was a construction worker. What are you looking for, Mary, from the Labor Department and the Biden administration to improve the lives of workers?
So these things that we've been talking about, just to protect workers' rights, like there is, we have this love of wealth in our country, and there are things that are important besides just attaining extreme wealth. I mean, it's important that we take care of the people that take care of us. And like when I saw pictures of the healthcare providers wearing trash bags because they didn't have proper, protective gear, it's things like that we need a champion in Washington that will make sure that workers are safe in doing their jobs, which is the reason labor organizations were formed in the first place.
And that leads me
to protect children.
Right, and that leads me to a final question that's very relevant here in the way that you framed that answer. For any change to happen, of course, we need voting access. As you know, voting access is threatened right now across the country. One of our neighboring states, Texas, a particular situation of concern. Thoughts on this and what unions are doing across the country about this threat?
there's nothing more important than the right to vote. And I'm a civics teacher, and I taught civics to young people on the verge of becoming adults. And there is nothing more important than citizens understanding and participating in the voting process. So we are working across the nation to protect voter rights.
Yeah, and it's a tough job, isn't it? I mean, getting the word out there, particularly in a media environment where we have entire networks devoted to a very different message.
Yes, yes. And there's been a lot of false messages going out to folks. And that is a big challenge as well, is to get control over the narrative of truth again and factual situations instead of just lies. I mean, there have been lies that have been perpetrated in the media, and people have believed them, and it's been very damaging.
Okay, well, Mary Parr-Sanchez, the president of NEA New Mexico. We covered a lot of ground, but very important issues, and we look forward to having you back again soon as we continue through this pandemic and all of the issues that we've discussed today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Fred. It's always a joy to be with you.
Good to have you here as well. That is our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered, 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.